BBC Newsnight has a report which really sums up some of the Machiavellian power that goes on within the world of politics, but also, arguably more importantly, within the world of the press barons in this country. I say arguably more importantly because we always assume that politicians are powerful. I think in Britain the power is questionable. Certainly, the Prime Minister has a lot of power as a position. The Chancellor has a lot of power, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, and probably most cabinet ministers. Of course, that power can come and go at any time in cabinet reshuffles, etc. The Prime Minister, by nature, is a very powerful person, that goes without saying. But the thing about politicians, all politicians, from lowly backbenchers right up to the Prime Minister, is that they are publicly scrutinized all the time, all the time. And as has been clear, going back about 50 years in this country, and probably further, arguably, the most powerful press barons in this country have the power to make or break a government. And there are many examples of this. But anyway, I want to touch just a bit on this Newsnight report. Apparently, David Cameron and Paul Dacre had a personal feud. And the circumstances of this are a bit unclear. But according to the BBC Newsnight report, what had happened was during the time of the referendum or leading up to the referendum, Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, one of the country's most powerful journalists, if not the country's most powerful journalist, um, had taken a very Eurosceptic stance. Now, nothing surprising about that. Dacre, in particular, has always been Eurosceptic. Cameron, of course, was a Remainer, but he called the referendum. Now, apparently, and this is news to me, but apparently Lord Rothermere, the owner of the Daily Mail, was pro-Remain. So what happened was David Cameron had a private meeting with Paul Dacre to basically say, lay off me a little bit. I'm trying to get, the best of both sides. Just lay off a little bit in the Euroscepticism because basically you're making my job harder. Now, this was kind of a case of it reminds me a little bit of when Tony Blair met Piers Morgan. Again, in that situation, you had a Labour Prime Minister with the Daily Mirror editor, which was, of course, pro Labour. The relationship between the country's most powerful editors and the Prime Minister is always an interesting one. Um, anyway, what happened was Dacre wouldn't budge, wouldn't leave off the Euroscepticism, and apparently this intensified when Cameron allegedly put pressure on Lord Rothermere to have Paul Dacre sacked. Well, that never happened. Cameron ended up resigning, so Dacre won this feud, if indeed this is the true version of events. Downing Street, at least I should say Cameron's spokespeople have denied it. No comment from Paul Dacre. The thing about Dacre, and this is true of most powerful tabloid barons, is they keep a very low profile. And this is why I would argue their position is possibly more powerful than the average politician. Um, because they are not accountable in the same way that a politician is. Now, people will say, oh, well, if people don't like newspapers, they don't have to buy them, therefore that's where the accountability lies. If people don't like politicians, they can vote them out of office. What I would argue is that politicians go through far more personal scrutiny, and it's much easier for a tabloid to rubbish a political party, a political leader, not just the Prime Minister, opposition leaders as well, as we have seen from the treatment of numerous Labour leaders. They can literally make or break someone's career in a way that is harder, I would argue, for a government to do with press barons. Because the real power going on here, the real power dynamic, has nothing to do with freedom of the press. I would argue that the level of power the likes of Dacre has, is a sort of dictatorship of the media, um, because they can destroy prime ministers, they could destroy governments. So it's actually the exact opposite of what goes on in totalitarian states. In totalitarian states, and I'll use China as a prominent example, the government has absolute 100% control over the media. So you will never ever see a Chinese journalist asking Xi Jinping a tough question. And any questions that are asked are entirely modeled for the party propaganda. It's that's a given. So totalitarian single party states like the People's Republic of China have absolute cast iron control on the media. And therefore the dictatorship um, situation lies in the politics, in the government. But I would argue the situation in liberal democracies, and Trump has touched on this, although I'll come back to Trump in a second because I think there's important points to take from that. But the power of the print media in this country, not so much the broadcast media, it's more the print media in this country. In the United States, it's broadcast media. I would argue newspapers have less of an influence there than they do here. In Britain, I would argue newspapers here have massive influence in a way that newspapers in France wouldn't have. Um, so if a government attacks the press can easily portray them as attacking a free media. So it's very difficult, actually, for even senior politicians to defend themselves. They simply have to play the game and they have to give a good performance. It's almost like, if I can make this analogy, it's almost like the press barons are judges and politicians are actors at an audition. I would honestly make that analogy because I think that it's much harder for a prime minister, as this case shows, to get rid of a tabloid editor than it is for a tabloid editor to get rid of a prime minister, which has happened before. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that Cameron's resignation was a direct result of this, but I have no doubt that it played a role. And people might say, oh, well, no one believes what they read in the papers. That's not actually true. The influence that papers have is immense. And the truth is, people are emotionally responsive to how headlines are portrayed. Now, I admit bias in this because I've never liked the Daily Mail. I find it incredibly pompous. I mean, the Sun is trash, but the arrogance of the Daily Mail in the way that they play judge, jury, and executioner, to me, sums up the power dynamic that is there. They will argue they're just holding the powerful to account and they're reporting on, they're using investigative journalism for all sorts of things. You see, this is not that I am saying everything in the Daily Mail is pure evil and wicked. They will have investigative journalism that has merits. But if you just read between the headlines, literally, if you just go a little bit deeper, you will see that in Dacre there is someone who thinks he is untouchable. And in a sense he almost is, because if, like I say, politicians take for example when Ed Miliband was being utterly lambasted by the right wing tabloids. If Miliband turned around and said, this is disgraceful the way they're treating me, they would have portrayed him as an authoritarian who wanted to control press freedom. So politicians can't even defend themselves without that accusation. And that, I think, is a huge problem because it is a false narrative that everything they do is about freedom of the press. But the truth is, they have very little accountability and transparency. They make a mistake on page one, they will make the amendment in small letters on page 30. A politician makes that sort of mistake, they would have to resign. So, where is the real power here? Now, obviously, Paul Dacre cannot, you know, send troops into war. He cannot press the nuclear button. There are things that a prime minister obviously has power, tabloid editors or any editors don't. So I'm not for a second saying the prime minister isn't powerful. Of course she is. But when these people play the victim and talk about, oh, the politicians are attacking press freedom, they fail to mention the lack of transparency that goes on with them, the lack of accountability. I mean, okay, you'll occasionally get a tabloid editor on Question Time, but that is about the height in which you will see these people. So there isn't an equilibrium in terms of transparency between the government and between press barons. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there is no corruption in the halls of power in Westminster. Of course there is. I'm not saying that there isn't scheming going on and there isn't politics as politics has always been. Of course there is. But I think it is a tragedy that we have a situation that unless governments pander to the gutter press, to the tabloids, they cannot win power, because if they don't do that, you then get a situation where their personal character is utterly destroyed, as was the case with Ed Miliband, as was the case with Michael Foot, as was the case with Neil Kinnock. And it's happened to a few Tories as well. So what do we see from this case? It became a personal feud. Now, am I saying it is right that a Prime Minister puts pressure on a media baron to fire an editor? No, I'm not saying that's right. But is it right that press barons can make or break a government because of their own ideological direction, as opposed to simple journalistic integrity, i.e., holding the powerful to account? The truth is, these people have the moral compass of a sponge. Tabloid editors, in my view, are totally immoral people. If they had any integrity, the very culture of tabloid journalism wouldn't be the way it is. And I think that phone hacking, it was certainly an expose of what was going on, but I don't think a great deal has changed in terms of the culture. You still get this phenomenally arrogant mindset. I mean, you can argue that politicians are arrogant as well, but the difference is when a politician is arrogant, people see it. Tabloid editors hide behind their desks. Politicians have to stand up on election night and listen to the verdict like a condemned man or a condemned woman. Editors, lay there behind their desk, putting out industrial scale distortion, not outright lies, but distortion. And this is so apparent. So I do want to, well, I mentioned I'd come back to Trump. One thing that Donald Trump has done is said something that very, very few other politicians are willing to say. He is actually willing to bite back against the media. Now, you could argue it's because Trump was a powerful figure to begin with. He's a multi-billionaire. He was a household name. It may be that he was in a position to do that in a way that, say, John Kasich or certain other politicians wouldn't necessarily have been able to do. This is not an endorsement of Trump for a second. And the danger with Trump's narrative is he is now sending out the message that all news is fake, which is not true at all. But the problem is big networks like CNN have got themselves into this mess by their arrogance and by refusing to sort of show any humility whatsoever. It's not that Trump is humble, he's not. He's a very arrogant individual. He's pompous and he behaves like a demagogue. But it has taken someone like that to basically bite back. Trump is basically behaving the same way as big media moguls. So maybe it's just a case of them getting a bit of their own fire. Um, and this is concerning because the side effect of that is then people won't trust any news. And that's not good for democracy. But what I notice in Western liberal democracies is that by and large, the media is not willing to take any responsibility. Some are better than others. I mean, I will say this about the BBC: there is a left wing bias, but the BBC at least responds to criticism. Okay, the bias is there, the politics is definitely there, but at least the BBC respond to criticism in a way that CNN doesn't. CNN simply ignores criticism, and then they whinge about being, why does no one trust us? What Donald Trump has done is said, this is the way it is from my perspective, and I'm going to bite back. Now, there's distortion going on both ways because this whole nonsense that Kellyanne Conway has come out with, um, Actually, it was Sean Spicer. We will produce alternative facts. Doesn't go down well. So basically, it's a war of distortion, and there's distortion on both sides. And I just use Donald Trump as a prominent example because he's president of the United States. He's arguably the most powerful person in the world at the moment, although Putin would definitely be in that running. Um, but that's what's going on. I want to see a change in the landscape whereby, just for once, media tycoons are also held accountable. And I don't mean the choice whether people buy their rags or not. That to me isn't enough. I want to see them under the same personal scrutiny as senior politicians. I think that's the way it should be because the power is roughly comparable. And then this reactionary narrative that they use, oh, you question us, therefore you're questioning press freedom. What the hell? What the hell gives them the pompous arrogance to say that they're above reproach? That's what I find sickening about their behaviour. And these are my personal views. I've always despised the tabloid press and their whole slimy culture, but I do understand that a prime minister is not in a position to simply ban them, because that would be an attack on the press. It's particularly odious press, but that's what would be. Rather, I want to see a situation where politicians don't face repercussions for saying, wait a second, you're wrong, and I'm going to call you out on this. And I would like to think if I ever got into the halls of power, I would be able to say, wait a second, you're going to attack me personally, you're going to slander me, I'm going to bite back. There has been a slightly different track. Some people in the Labour Party are saying they're no longer going to take the sort of attitude from the right wing tabloids. And that to me is refreshing. Andy Burnham said it, others have said it. Not because I'm a left winger, I'm not, but rather because there needs to be some sort of level playing field here, and I don't believe that there is. I believe the public do not really understand just how powerful these people are. Um, so anyway, I'll leave it there, but there's a lot of things to consider with this. Um, I want to see tabloid editors held to the same personal scrutiny as the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary or the Leader of Her Majesty's Opposition. I want to see the likes of Paul Dacre personally scrutinised. Now, the question is, if the job of the press is to hold the powerful to account, then who holds the press to account? That's the question. That is the question. And I don't think Ofcom has the power to do it. We have media regulators, which is better than nothing, but it's not enough. I believe we need a much more powerful body to hold these people to account. Who would it be? Possibly judges, possibly people within the industry who are no longer directly tied to the industry. Um, but it is very important that these media moguls are held to account.